Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, Episode 26, The Wars of William and Anne. Last time, we discussed the history of England from the Glorious Revolution in 1689 up through the death of Queen Anne in 1714. This was a period marked by two major but inconclusive wars against France, the 9 Years' War and the War of the Spanish Succession, or as they were known in the colonies, King William's War and Queen Anne's War. Today, we're going to begin our next series of episodes on the history of New England after the fall of the Dominion. For New England, this is a period of slow development, punctuated by these occasional wars against the French as well as by serious economic crises. When we last left New England, things were finally getting back to normal. Well, Plymouth Colony had been absorbed by Massachusetts, and Massachusetts itself received a new charter rather than getting its old one back, which meant that it was now a royal colony with a governor appointed in England. Massachusetts Bay Colony had now become the province of Massachusetts Bay. But other than that, things had mostly returned to normal. King William's War was still being fought, though the major operations had already ended. You'll recall that New York and Connecticut had sent an overland expedition to Montreal, but all they did was march into the wilderness for a few weeks before turning around thanks to bad planning. Massachusetts and Plymouth had sent a naval expedition to Quebec City under the command of Sir William Phips, but they too had retreated in disgrace, with over 1,000 lives lost due to disease and mishaps. After these failures, the war in North America mostly died down. There was skirmishing back and forth, but there were no big troop movements or anything like that. However, there was still plenty of violence. Neither side was able to field large armies, or well-equipped armies, or well-trained armies, so instead of direct engagements they often relied upon their Indian allies, like the Iroquois, who inhabited the area between them. Smaller groups of Indians and Europeans could cross the few hundred miles in between the colonies and launch smaller raids on outlying settlements. In one attack in Maine, 48 were killed and 70 taken prisoner. The frontier towns of New England were now on a real frontier, and they required support from the central government. These struggles were nothing like the massive engagements being fought in Europe at the same time. They were comparatively quite minor, just inconclusive struggles between two sets of colonists and their Indian proxies. The conflicts were only notable to those actually living in America. The English were still hoping to take Quebec, and to that end, Sir William Phips, leader of the previous naval expeditions, went to England to try to get more troops. He didn't succeed, but he did manage to get himself named as the first royal governor of Massachusetts instead. This appointment was partly thanks to Increase Mather, the minister/politician who was in England to represent the interests of Massachusetts. Mather thought that Phips would be an ally in his fight to keep Puritanism strong, and he had some influence with the king, and so he managed to talk King William into the appointment. Phips was also given command over the militias of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, in order to better coordinate the war effort. This was an attempt to partly reconstruct the Dominion, or at least the military unity that had existed under the Dominion. Needless to say, it was not a popular move with the New Englanders. Even in the face of a major war, the colonies were jealous of their independence. New Hampshire, since it was a royal colony itself, had no choice but to acquiesce. But Connecticut and Rhode Island both used their charters to resist this takeover. Their charters gave them the right to control their own militias, not the king. And in fact, they were successful. Governor Phips tried to take command of the militias, but there was enough resistance that he prudently decided not to push the matter further. Another attempt to put Connecticut's forces under the control of New York similarly failed. In fact, when the governor of New York went to Connecticut to try to take over the militia, threats were made against his life. Basically, so long as they had their charters, the colonies had considerable independence, which was all but impossible to bypass. And the crown was unwilling to yet again challenge the charters, so there was nothing to be done. The colonies kept their independence, and any further efforts to get them to cooperate met with similar stonewalling. I don't think there's any need to get into the rest of the war. There were further massacres and raids, but nothing significant was accomplished on either side. When the war finally wound down, things went back to exactly the way they had been before, no territorial changes or anything. The more important changes in Massachusetts were political. Now that the colony had a new charter and a new governor, it's time to look at how this new political system functioned. The governor was still a powerful figure, of course. He could veto bills, call and dismiss the general court, and nominate officials. There was still a legislature, the general court, with an upper and lower house. The lower house remained much the same as before, other than the fact that property qualifications for voting had taken the place of religious qualifications. Every incorporated town could send a delegate to the general court, although sometimes the smallest towns didn't, because of the expenses involved. Every town with at least 40 voters was required to send one, though. Towns with 120 voters could send 2 delegates, and Boston could send 4. In theory, these smaller towns were hugely overrepresented, but since they often didn't send delegates, it wasn't a huge problem. In fact, sometimes only half the towns sent men to Boston. The council, on the other hand, was significantly changed. It now had a role both as advisor to the governor and as the upper house of the legislature, more like in the southern colonies. And whereas before the magistrates had been elected, now they were chosen through a rather complicated method. In order to choose the magistrates for the next year, the upper and lower house each met separately and nominated candidates. Then the upper and lower houses both met together and selected from those candidates a smaller list of nominees. Those nominees would then become the members of next year's upper house unless the governor chose to veto some of them, which happened on occasion. So everyone had a say in who became a magistrate, everyone other than the voters, that is. And because the upper house was chosen by the previous year's legislature, they were more insulated from the current mood of the electorate. This would have encouraged greater stability at a time when politics was becoming less deferential in general. The government was also less religious than it had been. Government leaders no longer conferred with religious leaders about secular affairs. That just wasn't going to happen anymore given the new circumstances. Most of the leadership was still Puritan, of course, but the government no longer had the role of directly sustaining Puritan supremacy. That was in the past. The theocratic side of New England was slowly slipping away, though it would linger on a while in Connecticut thanks to that colony's unusual independence. So with the basics worked out, it was time for Massachusetts to hammer out the specifics of their new government. Delegates to the reconstituted General Court met on June 8, 1692. They soon got to work, coming up with new election procedures and defining their own place within the system. They claimed the powers of the House of Commons for themselves, the right to set their own agenda, to raise taxes, to approve the governor's nominees to office, to initiate legislation, etc. They had had these sorts of rights before, of course, but they made sure to maintain them under the new regime. The General Court also passed a bill which largely restored the towns to their previous status, after they had lost their independence under the Dominion. However, the legislature did also impose some standardization on the towns. For instance, it had been customary for the towns to choose their selectmen annually, but now that became mandatory. The General Court also imposed standards of conduct on the town governments for things like admitting new inhabitants and public education. All town laws were now subject to approval by the General Court. In practice, they still had a great deal of independence, but not as much as in the early years. And the towns themselves were changing, thanks most of all to their rapid growth. The common land was divided up and forbidding forests were replaced with well-maintained fields. As towns became larger, they often became more diverse, at least relative to what had come before. The unanimity that was so prized by the New Englanders was increasingly impossible to achieve. Remember the town of Sudbury from episode 12? The town that wound up splitting in two over the issue of land rights? That sort of thing became increasingly common as towns became divided between different factions or different economic interests. For instance, a town might be divided between merchants and sailors living by the coast and farmers living a bit further inland. Both sides would constantly fight over local issues like where to build a church or a new schoolhouse or how taxes were to be raised. In some cases, the town would just split in two, with the inland half becoming one town and the coastal half becoming another town. That sort of thing wasn't always possible, but when it did happen, the new, smaller towns could once again become cohesive units, preserving the old style of town government a little while longer. This sort of splitting was pretty common. In 1695, there were 83 towns in Massachusetts. 20 years later, there were over 20 new towns, most of which were created by secession from older towns. One town, Dedham, wound up split into 6 new jurisdictions. Another effect of this rapid growth was that the selectmen, who were the equivalent of city councilmen basically, became less powerful. In the earliest days of colonization, the town meetings had been all-powerful, but over time the meetings had delegated more responsibilities to the selectmen. The meetings still had ultimate authority, but the selectmen had a great deal of independence in practice. Well, as life in the towns became more complex, so did the government. That meant that you needed more than just a few selectmen to run things. You needed a whole bunch of officials doing various jobs. As a result, town meetings increased in importance again since there were just so many more officials to pick. Town meetings were held 4 or 5 times a year instead of just once or twice. The selectmen served for shorter periods of time as well. According to Benjamin W. Laborie, in the town of Dedham, quote, the annual turnover increased from 27% before 1686 to 40% in the period 1687 to 1736. The cumulative experience of the incumbents fell by half, from 50 years to 25 during the same period, end quote. And the selectmen were more likely to just lose their election bids outright. This population growth also meant that land near the coast became more expensive, which encouraged many young men to migrate further inland. In some towns by mid-century, over 40% of young men left. Others became artisans instead of farmers, and slowly the economy diversified further. Still others just became poor, something almost unheard of back when land was abundant. A few became rich, of course, usually thanks to trade, which continued to expand, especially the import of food from the other American colonies, since New England wasn't really fertile enough to feed its own population. Of course, although the British now had their own officials in the colony to enforce the Navigation Acts, plenty of this trade was illegal. But money is money, however you get it, and so bigger, nicer homes were going up in Boston and Salem, the main port towns. The colony was still pretty egalitarian compared to Europe or Virginia, but not compared to its recent past. For example, from 1687 to 1771, the share of Boston residents without property doubled, and the top quarter of residents went from owning 66% of the wealth to 78%. Again, we can see further contact with the outside world eroding the distinctiveness of New England. Education continued to improve as more towns set up grammar schools, as the General Court required them to do. By the end of the colonial period, a large majority of residents were literate, especially among men, since women weren't generally sent to school. So this was the New Massachusetts which Sir William Phips was returning to. The differences were in many ways subtle, but they were real and only getting bigger. Governor Phips was inexperienced in government, to say the least. Remember, he came from a poor shepherding family and rose to become a ship captain. Maybe that gave him leadership experience, but running a government is very much its own sort of thing. Therefore, Phips tended to defer to others. For example, he let the council nominate officials even when it was his prerogative to do so. King William had hoped that the new charter would give Massachusetts governors who were willing to push back against Puritan stubbornness, but that wasn't proving to be the case, at least not yet. Anyway, Phips never really had the confidence of the colonists or the General Court, given his low birth and his inexperience and his temper, so even when he did try to assert himself, he faced significant pushback. Take, for instance, a dispute over election procedure. A bill had been passed which required that the delegates actually live in the towns they were elected in. This was partly to keep opponents of Phips who lived in Boston from running for office in outlying towns to increase their power, but nevertheless in 1694, 6 delegates were elected to the General Court from towns they weren't residents of. According to one contemporary account, quote, "The governor, hearing of this, came down to the representatives in fury, without his hat, and said that he had heard that a member, against whom he had objected, had refused to leave the House unless the House put him out." End quote. Phips wanted to throw this illegally elected member out himself, but the delegates said that only they had the authority to decide their own membership. In the end, though, the delegates capitulated when the governor forced the issue by threatening to hold new elections for the seats on his own authority. By the way, in England, members of Parliament did not have to live in the districts they supposedly represented. Sometimes they hardly had anything to do with their districts. But although Governor Phips had a bad relationship with the General Court, there were more important things going on. Mostly, the Assembly was preoccupied with tweaking the laws of Massachusetts so that they conformed to English law, as well as proposing further changes to match the new situation, including a Charter of Liberties similar to the one New York was trying to get passed. Just as in New York, the Massachusetts Charter of Liberties was rejected by England. In fact, all sorts of acts were rejected by the Crown, ranging from land rights to judicial reforms. The English government was finally making its will known. Most famously, though, this was also the time of the Salem witch trials. There's no need to get into all the details here, I'm sure there are plenty of podcasts for that. But basically, some young girls in Salem began having fits, and a number of women were accused of causing the fits through witchcraft. The accusations soon spiraled out of control and into nearby towns as well, not just Salem. Belief in witchcraft was near universal among Christians at the time, and the Puritans were especially intolerant of any perceived deviancy. Indeed, Increase and Cotton Mather, some of the leading thinkers of New England, were quite explicit about the existence of witchcraft. In the words of Cotton Mather, quote, "The New Englanders are a people of God, settled in those which were once the devil's territories. The devil, thus irritated, tried all sorts of methods to overturn this poor plantation. I believe that never were more satanical devices used for the unsettling of any people under the sun than would have been employed for the extirpation of the vine which God has here planted." End quote. Accused witches had been executed before, but only as an occasional thing, never in any big, coordinated way. But as the number of the accused grew and grew, Governor Phips created a special court to oversee the proceedings. The accused were by no means given a fair trial. The court even allowed so-called spectral evidence, that is, evidence based on encounters with spirits people had in their dreams. Needless to say, with these sorts of low standards, the number of accused kept growing and growing. Even the governor's wife fell under suspicion. But once accusations started to touch elite families, it was clearly time to shut the whole thing down, and that's exactly what happened. The proceedings were brought to an abrupt end. After a year of mass hysteria, 20 people had been executed and many more had been imprisoned. Over time, the Salem witch trials would come to be seen as an example of everything that was wrong with Puritanism, and as a warning to future generations, but at the time it was seen as a fairly small affair. Noteworthy, but minor. After the witch trials wound down, Phipps was recalled back to England, although not because of the witch trials. It was more because of his bad relationship with other colonial officials. And in 1693 he literally beat up a captain in the Royal Navy over his refusal to follow some of Phipps's orders. The Board of Trade wasn't a fan of that kind of thing, and so Phipps was out. Phipps returned to England to face an investigation against him, but he died of a sudden illness before the proceedings wrapped up. He was only 44. With Phipps gone, Massachusetts was now ruled by the lieutenant governor, William Stoughton, for most of the next 7 years, until his death in 1701. Stoughton had been the judge in charge of the court overseeing the Salem witch trials. He was a much more normal sort of Puritan leader. He wasn't a vulgar sea captain, that is. And his time in power went much more smoothly than under Phipps, partly just because he deferred to the general court a lot. There were fairly minor disputes over stuff like how to reincorporate Harvard under the new charter, but nothing major. King William's War officially ended, but the war had really wound up a while ago. I should mention that I'm not going to be mentioning every governor who served. That would just take way too long, and plenty of those guys were short-lived or otherwise inconsequential, so I don't think we'll be losing too much. But do keep in mind that I might jump ahead, skipping over some governors without pointing it out. Anyway, after Stoughton died, he was replaced by Joseph Dudley, who would remain governor for the next 13 years. Joseph Dudley was a Massachusetts native, but he was no unreconstructed Puritan. He was quite pro-English. He'd been a member of the council under the Dominion, and after the revolt he was imprisoned by the angry colonists for most of a year. Afterwards he spent time in England and even became a member of Parliament. As a result of all this, he was viewed with suspicion. It was obvious that Dudley was much more sympathetic to royal demands than either Phipps or Stoughton had been, and much less sensitive to local demands. Of course, that was partly how he got the job. While he was in England, he spent his time cultivating relationships with important leaders there and trying to seem as loyal to the crown as possible without breaking all his ties in Massachusetts. That was how politics worked now, at least for the governorship. It was about who you knew in London, not about your position in the colonies. Remember, Phipps had gotten the job thanks to the recommendation of the Mathers, who were well connected at court. Dudley was also named as governor of New Hampshire. It wasn't actually totally uncommon to name one person as the governor of multiple colonies, particularly ones as close as Massachusetts and New Hampshire. In fact, the two colonies will share a governor for the next 40 years. Dudley was also given command of the Connecticut and Rhode Island militias, but just like Governor Phipps before him, he was unable to convince the colonists to let him take command. Their charters still held firm. But in Massachusetts, Governor Dudley was, unsurprisingly, more forceful than his predecessors had been, although with somewhat mixed success. He represented a minority faction within the colony, and he had plenty of enemies, most notably the Mathers, who represented the traditionalist faction. They even went so far as to attack him through anonymous pamphlets, accusing him of corruption and collusion with the French. More importantly, Dudley also clashed repeatedly with the general court over a number of issues. For one thing, unlike in most colonies, the governor didn't have a regular salary from England. Instead, he was at the mercy of the legislature for his pay. He repeatedly tried to force the court to grant him a regular salary, but they refused, instead only agreeing to pay him on a year-by-year basis. Even instructions from the Queen specifically stating that the general court should grant him a salary were insufficient. They also regularly fought over appointments. For instance, in one year Dudley rejected a full 5 nominations to the council, which was quite high. Needless to say, these men were mostly people he had personal or professional disagreements with. But as a result of these vetoes, the council at least was pretty compliant to the governor's wishes. Considering how much distrust there must have been between Dudley and everyone else, things were calmer than you might have expected. At any rate, there was nothing to precipitate a major crisis. He was unpopular, but effective enough. Perhaps the biggest reason was that a new war with the French had begun, only 5 years after the last one had ended, which undoubtedly helped unify the colonists in the face of a common enemy. This was the War of the Spanish Succession, or Queen Anne's War, which I introduced last time. This was a lengthy war which lasted most of Dudley's 13 years in office. While King William's War was fought entirely in the northern colonies, this also led to fighting in the south, on the border between Carolina and Spanish Florida. But I'll talk about that whenever we get back to Carolina. For now, I'll stick to the northern theater. The war effort was mostly in the hands of Governor Dudley himself, although he did have to contend with the general court in order to get funding for the military. Waging war was an expensive business. At the height of the war, Massachusetts was spending £30,000 a year, an unprecedented sum by their standards. Mostly the Assembly was willing to go along with Dudley's demands, though they did push back sometimes, for instance when they declined to approve the money to pay for the rebuilding of the fort at Pemaquid in Maine. Dudley was a more able and active administrator than his immediate predecessors, but in general the war was managed poorly. Petty disputes about money, bad planning and coordination, general parochialism and lack of cooperation for the common good, all of these things took their toll. During the first few years of the war, the conflict remained small-scale, mostly just local raiding and skirmishing, like at the end of the last war. In 1703, a force of some 500 French and Indians was sent to raid on the border with Maine, and 150 settlers were killed. That was a big attack considering the low population in America, but still only of minor significance. The English, for their part, raided Acadia to the north, and so the fighting went back and forth for several years, with neither side doing any real damage to the other's position. However, from 1707 onwards, the English tried to expand the war by launching much bigger assaults on the French. Now, you could basically divide the French holdings into two parts. On the coast, you have Acadia, around what is now Nova Scotia. That was where William Phips had successfully taken Port Royal. Further inland, down the St. Lawrence River and above the Great Lakes, you have Quebec, which was the more important part of New France at the time. That was where Montreal and Quebec City were, the towns which the English had failed to capture in that big joint assault in 1690. The New Englanders tried similar strategies again. Just like last time, they launched an attack on Port Royal in Acadia. 1,100 men from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island were sent. This time, however, the result was another colossal, pathetic failure. The English landed so far away from Port Royal that the French had time to shore up their defenses, and the march to the fort took so long and was so poorly organized that the men lost all confidence in their leaders. So they just withdrew back to Massachusetts. This was despite the fact that, according to Osgood, quote, the English force equaled 2/3 of the total population of Acadia, while the actual defenders of Port Royal, inclusive of 60 Canadians who had just arrived, numbered about 300, end quote. Once again, the English had defeated themselves. The humiliated New Englanders decided to send their force straight back to Port Royal to try again, but this time it somehow went even worse. They couldn't even land their ships this time. But despite this fairly dismal record, in 1709, the British government approved plans for another double-pronged attack on Quebec, like the failed attempt in the previous war. Once again, a force would be sent by land from New York and by sea from New England. The British even asked for a few hundred soldiers from New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Preparations actually went pretty well. A large force was put together, enough ships were requisitioned, all of the basic logistical stuff that had bedeviled previous expeditions was taken care of. However, military problems in Spain meant that the British weren't able to send the assistance that they'd promised, and so the whole thing was called off. The colonies had spent tens of thousands of pounds to no end. Undaunted by all this, New England decided to launch yet another attack on Port Royal in Acadia, and this time they were able to get British support. Specifically, the British sent 400 Marines, who joined 1,500 New Englanders and some Indians. This was quite a turnaround from a few decades ago when the English were sending troops to Massachusetts to intimidate them into submission. Now the New Englanders were asking for soldiers. In fact, this is one of the first times that the British have had to support the colonies militarily in such a big way. New England had fought King Philip's War alone, after all. Anyway, this expedition was successful. The English once again had an overwhelming advantage over the small French garrison, but this time there was no mismanagement and the fort surrendered without a fight. And this time the occupation of Acadia was permanent. It was now part of the British Empire, though it wound up in Canada, not the United States in the end. With Acadia conquered, plans were made for yet another attack on Quebec. Again, a force was raised, and this time it was backed by thousands of British troops. Again, the plan was for a two-part land and sea attack, and yet again it was a disaster. There were problems with logistics and tensions between the British troops and the colonists, but those weren't the cause of the failure. Actually, what happened was, due to a navigation error, a number of ships were wrecked in the mouth of the St. Lawrence River and 700 men were lost. The naval expedition was thus abandoned. When the land expedition heard about the failure, they retreated back as well. Once again, the campaign was lost without even encountering the enemy. This marked the effective end of the war in North America. Quebec remained unconquered, despite several attempts which by all rights should have succeeded. Acadia was now under English control, but still mostly populated by French settlers and Indians. It would be fought over again. Really, nothing much had changed. Thousands of deaths and huge amounts of wasted money, but that's about it. Next episode, we'll take a break from the narrative to look at the political system of the region in general, as well as the elections being held among the slaves of New England. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode of the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.